All right, so we've got our basic daylight Rosetta. And what we're gonna do is go ahead and start to figure out how to manipulate it. So again, we've got our 3 columns, ISO, shutter speed, and f-stop. So let's start with what the basic daylight exposure would tell us. So again, basic daylight exposure is something that's been around a really long time, right? Because we've got the sun, and the sun's kind of a given brightness, right? And it's really like the strongest light that we have, right? When we start adding artificial light, those don't build up to be quite as strong as the sunlight, right? I mean, unless you're like super, super close to it. But typically what's gonna happen is the sun's the brightest thing. Now we can always have less than sunlight, right? There's times where it's gonna be in the shade, or maybe there's clouds that come out, those sort of things that are gonna diminish the amount of light. But basically our standard is sun, right? Full sun. So what we're gonna try to determine is based on the Sunny 16 rule. So what that tells us is that we're gonna use an f-stop of 16, right? So because it's the Sunny 16 rule, right? And so it says that if it's sunny, we can use f16 and our ISO and shutter speed can be the same. Now, typically if I'm shooting, I want the lowest ISO possible so that it has the cleanest like grain structure. So typically we may have done something like f16 at 100 and shutter speed at 100. So this would be my normal everyday exposure. And there's lots of times where I may not want to use that, right? There might be times that I don't want to shoot at 100 because I want to shoot at a 25th of a second or something like that. And so the way that the wheel is set up, or the Rosetta, is that it also can figure out what are the equivalent exposures, right? And again, it's think of it like scales, right? It's a balance. So if we have the f-stop set, or we have the ISO set, we can, once one of those variables is stuck, then what we can do is we can start to offset to keep the balance, right? So if this is a perfectly balanced scale, and for right now, if I'm not moving f16, I can move these ones, right? So what would happen if this is my column of shutter speeds, right? So these are shutter speeds. So if I went to a 50th of a second, that's gonna open up the shutter for a longer amount of time to slow it down a little bit. But because of that, it's letting in more light. And if I just changed my shutter speed, it would be brighter. So what I need to do is reduce the sensitivity to light. So what I'm gonna do is reset this one by 1, boom. And now I'm at 50-50, right? Which again, is our Sunny 16 rule. My ISO and my shutter speed are the same. If I wanted to move down to 25, I could move that to 25 and again, offset it with the ISO. And again, now they rematched. I've got 25, 25 at f16. So those are equivalent exposures. They're the same amount of light, just a different way to get to it. So that I can change my setup a little bit and get an effect that I want if I have those controls. Now, let's go back to 100, 100. So the thing is though, with our cameras, right, if we were shooting with the DSLRs at school, our camera has the ability to change f-stop. So I could change this one or set it to f16. Our cell phones don't have that choice. The cell phones only will shoot at f2, at least best as I could tell. Sometimes it's 2.2, sometimes 2.4, but it's somewhere in that range, and you can figure out for your own camera and determine that. And we'll do some testing and we can kind of narrow in the numbers just a little bit. So I actually need to shoot it at 2.0. So I need to look here and go, okay, well, if f16 is the Sunny 16 rule, I'm 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stops away from f16. So my camera just by default already opens up the lens 6 times beyond f16. So we're gonna figure out, well, what is the correct exposure for being outside in the sun, because that's where we're gonna shoot most of the time, right? So our lens is already gonna be open to 2.0. So I need to offset or figure out what the 6 stops of sensitivity, because I've made it more sensitive to light. So I need to desensitize the camera by either increasing shutter speed so that it's faster and it reduces the amount of light coming in, or I make the camera less sensitive to light. So those are kind of my 2 options. So I'm gonna start with ISO because to me, if I can lower the ISO, it just makes it cleaner anyway, and if I need it to be less sensitive to light. So we're at, we're still set to our Sunny 16, right? So from here, we're gonna start moving away from Sunny 16, and I'm gonna pay attention to this one, which is 2, which is my f-stop. So what we need to do is I'm gonna make it less sensitive to light. So right now, nothing's matching, right? There's no ISO that I can possibly use in order to shoot at a 6400, right? There's no ISO over there. So I'm gonna move and make it less sensitive to light, right? So if this is my f16, I can only move this one 2 times, right? There's only 2 more f-stops. So I want to increase that by 2. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to shift this one. I'm going to keep these steady, and I'm going to move this one 2. So I'm going to go 1, 2. So that's let in more light. But then what I need to do is start to reduce, another, so that was only 2 stops. We need to go a full 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we need an additional 4. So what we need to do is start to move. So now what we need to determine is for our camera, and our camera only shoots at f2. So what I'm going to start to do is manipulate this one to get us down to f2. And it's going to take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stops in order to get us to f2. But by doing that, I've just opened up the lens, and let in a ton more light. So we're going to need to start to offset that, right? So for now, I'm at f2 at 100, 100, which is going to be, it's going to be white, basically. There's the 6 stops overexposed. So we're going to start to desensitize the actual sensitivity to light to start with. So right here, I do need to do 6 times. So this one right now is at 100, so I could make it less sensitive to light by 1, less sensitive to light by 2. So that's all I can do on ISO though. I can't make the camera less sensitive than 25. So then the rest I'm going to need to start to offset with my shutter speed, right? So I need to again reduce the amount of light. So currently I'm at 100, so I could go 1 stop, 2 stops, 3 stops, 4 stops. Oops, let's try that again. I think I didn't move far enough. 1 stop, 2 stops, 3 stops, 4 stops. So now I've offset these 2 by 2 and 4, which gave me 6 stops of light, which offset what we had to change this to get to our camera f-stop. So what I'm going to go ahead and do, and I've already done this on here, is go ahead and make a little mark on here that says that this is the sunny exposure. So f2, 1600, 25, those are all the correct exposure for when it's sunny outside if my camera has an f-stop of 2. And we're just going to use that as like kind of the default. So this now becomes my sunny 16 exposure because we've had to open up the lens because that's what our cell phones do. So if I go outside, I'm going to take a picture at f2, 600, 25, and that's going to give me a good exposure outside in the sun. Now, what that does is pretty much by default, that's a really fast shutter speed. And so what the phones have set us up to do is always have stop action, right? They don't want motion blur, no matter what. They want to make sure you've got a clean, crisp image to show your friends and people around the world, right? So, just its basic settings has a really low ISO and a high shutter speed because it's got such a small opening for the f-stop. Then again, if I did want to kind of move away from that, I don't have a lot of choices in the sun because I can't make it less sensitive to light and I can't close it down. So I'm pretty much stuck with a fast shutter speed outside. Now, what I could do though is get out of the sun. Right? I could move to the shade. If I move into the shade, there's 3 times less light than there is out in the sunshine. And the shade's pretty much always the same. It's 3 stops less. Or if it's a fully overcast day, then it's behind the clouds, 3 stops. So we just need to know, well, what happens when I move to the shade and what do I do when it's, a cloudy day? So what we need to do, we can't move this one. I'd like to keep this one where it is if I can, because I want it less sensitive to light. So what I want to do is slow down the shutter speed. So it's 3 stops for clouds or for shade. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this one by 3. So I'm just going to increase, again, because we've lost light. We went into the shade, so there's less light in the shade. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go 1, 2, 3. And that's my exposure for shade. So if I'm in the shade, I can shoot at f2 at a 200th of a second at f20 or at ISO 25. And so I've marked those with a little symbol that is a cloud. So cloud, shade, same thing. So this will always be my correct exposure when I go into the shade. So if I want to take a quick portrait, I could do that. It's going to have a low f-stop number. It's got a fast enough shutter speed so that it can, stop most motion and a low ISO. Now, if I was in there and I wanted to increase the ISO, let's say I wanted to do stop action inside of the shade, well, then I would need to increase my shutter speed some. Let's say I wanted to shoot at 800. Then I might have to go, 1, 2, well, let's do 1 at a time. So if I go 1, that just cut the light in half, so I need to increase my ISO. And then again, if I want a faster shutter speed, I could go there. And then I would have to increase my ISO by another 1. So if I wanted to shoot with a faster shutter speed in the shade, I could go ahead and get that. It just means I need to increase my ISO. If I wanted it all the way at 1600, I would just need an ISO of 200, right? So I can figure out what are those equivalent exposures. So let's go back to our shade. There we go. And that's why the symbols really help once you get it kind of all labeled. So there's my shade. Now, the other one that we shoot a lot in is inside. And, inside of our classroom, when we have the overhead lights on, it's pretty much like a kitchen, right? They're overhead fluorescent lights. So that scenario is about 8 stops less than being outside in the sun. And I know it seems weird because when we're outside, it looks like it's bright and sunny, but it's not, right? Like when we're inside the classroom, it seems like it's bright, but it's way less. We're talking 8 stops less, and that's a doubling, of light. So it's significantly less. So again, when we try to factor out, well, what would it be inside? So if I'm in my room and I just have like an overhead light on and the window light that's around, that's about 8 stops less. So if my camera has to stay at f2, and here's my other f-stop and shutter speed for the shade already, so we're already 3 stops less. So we need to go ahead and move the wheel an additional 5 stops, right? Because the shade's already 3, so we need to go an additional 5. So I'm gonna get it set so that I could shoot inside and still be able to hand hold the camera okay. And so typically, as long as we stay around 100, it should be fast enough that we can then not have to have camera shake and blur inside of the classroom or inside of the house. So what I'm gonna do is, since I still have 5 that I need to go, I'm gonna increase the amount of light by 1. So I'm gonna move this to 100. So that'll give me f2 at 100. But I still have 4 stops that I need to make up. So rather than slowing it down, where I might start seeing like movement in hands and things like that if somebody's walking and I'm taking a picture, I'm gonna start to increase ISO instead. So in order to do that, I'm just gonna move just this one. So I'm gonna go 1 stop, because I still have 4 to go, 2, 3, and 4. So when I do that, now I have an exposure that will work inside of the house or inside of the classroom that will also produce a fast enough shutter speed so that we don't have blur. So I'm at f2, 100 for the shutter speed and 400 for the ISO. And at ISO 400, we're not gonna see a huge increase in noise. So that should be safe to do. So that will be a good exposure. Now for our blur assignment, what we actually wanna do is go even slower. So what we'd wanna do is instead, is not use the ISO increase and actually keep increasing our shutter speed. So if we wanted to have the longest exposure possible so we could record some of that movement, then we're gonna do it this way. So I'm just gonna set us back, let's see, from where we are now, I'm gonna go ahead and reduce my ISO by 4. So I'm gonna go 1, 2, 3, 4. And then instead of it offsetting it that way, I'm gonna increase this one by 4. So I'm gonna go 1, 2, 3, 4. And so when I do that, this would be let me grab my pencil. So this could also be I'm gonna put a mark on this side. And this little symbol is just indicating fluorescent light. So I could, as an alternative, shoot at this setting for fluorescent light. And that'll give me a longer exposure so that I can get blur. And if I find out that this is too much blur and I'd rather shoot at 25, I could always go 1, 2, and then increase this by 2, 1, 2. All right, so I can always figure out those equivalent exposures if I just use the balance. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna do a test to figure out, well, what are those effects, right? How much movement do I get at these different slower shutter speeds? Or how much do I really need to actually freeze and stop motion? So that we can make choices depending on what it is that we wanna do. We can set the camera in a way and determine for ourselves the visual effect that's going to happen. Because if we just let the camera be on auto, it's gonna probably almost always try to do stop action because it wants a sharp, crisp picture and it doesn't want any movement and it's set up to avoid that. And so if we wanna do some of these other effects that are gonna capture and show that movement and record some of that and give it a sense of movement in a different way, because stop motion oftentimes just looks frozen. And so what we want to do is, we want to have options and be able to control that. And so this will help us figure out what those are because the camera's not going to do it by itself. Okay. If you get confused, just take a pause, rewind it, reset, get things back, label it. I think that the labeling will really help you be able to start to figure stuff out, because now if I need to go back, I can go, oh, well, what was the shady one? And I can just look here and go, oh, well, shade. I can just go, there's sun, so there's shade, and then there's shade. And now I'm back to shade. And if I want to switch it up and I don't want this combination, well, I can start offsetting and go this way and that way, and so on. So we can start to move those around in order to figure out those exposures. So hopefully that helps, guys.